Hello there, my name's Tim Walter. I'm about looking at a fundamental shift of perception in your life for improved well-being using meditation, mindfulness and dowsing. Have a look at the videos on my channel, try it for yourself, and if it's the sort of thing that you're after, do click subscribe and say hello in the comments beneath all the videos. Jeffrey Mishlove is something of a national treasure in the spiritual, metaphysical arena of the USA. A radio and television interviewer for decades, he has spoken with hundreds of respected scientists and spiritual teachers about life and death. I had the great pleasure of speaking with him recently about his Bigelow Prize-winning essay, Beyond the Brain, in which he puts forward a highly convincing and evidence-based treatise about life after death. He is known both as a parapsychologist and a psychologist, as well as an interviewer, but his career only took its path due to a dream he had in his early 20s. And that was about his great-uncle Harry. In my conversation with Jeffrey, we hear about that dream, and this is part one of the interview, which is really a warm-up to part two, in which we talk in more depth about the power of the subjective nature of reality. Here then is part one, in which I start by simply asking, who is Jeffrey Mishlove?
Well, I have a doctoral degree in parapsychology. I earned that in 1980 from the University of California at Berkeley. In the United States, to my knowledge, and possibly in the world, it's the only doctoral diploma that actually says parapsychology on it. And I earned it through an individual interdisciplinary doctoral major. So I've been pursuing this field now for nearly half a century.
Fantastic. And you got into that primarily because of your visitation, shall we say, by a great uncle?
That's right. That's back in 1972. If you had known me then, I was a graduate student in criminology at Berkeley. I was working in the prison at the psychiatric unit of San Quentin prison, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. And I had a dream. It's actually the most powerful dream of my entire life, in which my great uncle Harry appeared to me in the dream and spoke deeply about, it was a soul-to-soul connection. And when I awakened from the dream, I was crying tears of joy and simultaneously singing a very sacred song from the Jewish religious tradition, my own background. I wrote home to my parents and said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." And my mother called me as soon as she got my letter and said, "How did you know?" That's the moment he died, actually, is when I had the dream, because he had gone to religious services, came home early in the morning around 9:30, sat down on his favorite chair and passed away. And I was in California, so it was 7:30 for me. I was still in bed asleep.
As you described it there, it was a very emotional dream, it was a very emotional visitation, it was a very soul-to-soul connection as you described it. Had you had anything like that at all before that occurred for you?
I have not. No, I haven't had a dream like that either before or since. Now, I've had lots of synchronicities and remote viewing and telepathy. Over the years, I've had an opportunity to experience many different kinds of parapsychological events, but this one was really the most powerful, far and away, and the most unique of my whole life.
Right, so it really was that powerful for you, and you woke up singing as well as and crying. So is that
singing and crying tears of joy?
Amazing. So was that sacred song that was being sung? Did that have a connection to souls and passing or anything like that? Was it a ceremonial song?
Well, it's a song called Avinu Malkeinu. I think Jewish members of your audience will recognize it. It is only sung during the what are known as the high holy holidays in Judaism. It really is a song asking God for forgiveness. And I don't think that was the important part of it for me. It was more like just connecting with my great uncle at a very deep level. Now, he was a very religious man. So I think the song was a way of expressing the closeness I felt to him at that moment.
Yeah. Were you close to him in when he was alive, when you were growing up? Was he a significant part of the family?
Well, at that time I was like 25 years old and he was in his 80s. And as a child, I used to visit him. He owned a little corner grocery store, and we'd come and visit. And he'd open up his freezer in the grocery store and hand all the children an Eskimo pie.
Right.
And to a child, a man who has a whole freezer full of Eskimo pies is like how you couldn't be any wealthier than that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. That's great. And so you're currently right now coming right up to date, right bang up to date. You're currently sort of publicizing your essay that you basically were the grand prize winner for the Bigelow Institute. So the competition, it would describe it as competition, I guess so. Best evidence for the survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. And you wrote a marvelous essay, Beyond the Brain, you've called it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was 100 pages, and it began with the story I just told you of how my Uncle Harry. The important point there is it changed my life permanently, because after having that experience, I didn't feel I could continue as a criminology student any longer, studying the negative side of human deviance. I decided I had to switch my focus to the positive side of human deviance. And so after much agony and a lot of help from invisible sources, I managed to create an individual interdisciplinary major in parapsychology. At the same time, I launched a career doing basically what you and I are doing right now, interviewing people.
Yeah, and you did really well at that. Was it 15 years on, was it PBS that you were on?
Well, I started out in the radio. I started out on Pacifica Radio in Berkeley. I'd had another psychic dream that guided me to do this, incidentally. Eventually switched to TV. You would like to hear about the other dream?
Yeah, I would.
Well, okay. I was agonizing for months after the dream of my Uncle Harry. How can I make this switch? How can I go? Because at any university, if you want to study crime, if you want to study psychopathology, there are many opportunities. But if you want to study intuition, creativity, mysticism, psychic functioning, life after death, try doing that at most universities. It's almost impossible. And there were no resources at Berkeley. So I was agonizing for months about this. And I think that's important to say. I had developed a very clear mental focus about what I wanted to do. And after a couple of months of this, one day I knew the answer was going to come to me in a dream. I just knew it. And I went to bed knowing I was going to have a dream, and I did. That night, I dreamt I was visiting some friends of mine in Berkeley. I got to their apartment, knocked on the door. Nobody answered. I took a key. I found a key, let myself in. And in the dream, there was a magazine in the middle of their living room floor called EYE. I was paging through the magazine when I woke up feeling this sense of exhilaration, like this is the answer. But of course, I had no idea what it meant. So I acted out the dream. I actually went to this apartment 5 miles away across town, knocked on the door, nobody answered. And I happened to know where they hid a key. So I took the key from under their doormat, let myself in, walked into the living room, and there in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine. The name of the magazine was Focus. Brought focus to my life, literally. For any of your viewers in the San Francisco Bay Area, they will know Focus is the magazine of listener-sponsored radio and television, KQED. And as I'm paging through the magazine, it dawned on me, for the first time in my life, I could pursue my interests by getting involved in nonprofit, listener-sponsored media. So that's what I did, which was a huge shift for me at the time. I didn't own a radio or a television. And in fact, I was a long-haired hippie in those days, and I didn't believe in electronic communication. I thought it was all phony baloney, that the only authentic communication was face-to-face. But I changed my mind at that moment, and ever since then, I've been doing interviews.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. So, yeah, so that was definitely a precognitive dream, but the fact that you decided to kind of act out the dream made it precognitive in that sense, which was interesting.
Yeah, and when I tell people this story, I usually explain, what's the lesson in it? And I think it is that when you resolve to become the best version of yourself, the universe is going to reach out to help you. That's what the universe wants for each person.
No, absolutely, and that's really what you kind of feel as though you're doing now, isn't it? Is helping people really kind of come to terms. I've got it written down here somewhere about actually what you've said, how you describe what you're doing now, which is to help people come to terms with this whole approach to life.
Well, so many people have psychic potential. In fact, you could say the entire human race. We have psychic gifts that we deny. In fact, it's very intriguing to me. I recently did an interview about Ingo Swann, the great psychic, the fellow who helped pioneer what is now known as remote viewing in the United States, which I think it's a big movement worldwide now. And Ingo Swann was sort of the person who started it all. And he maintains that the human race has enormous psychic potential, but there are forces, he suspected, even extraterrestrial forces, trying to convince us that this is all hogwash so that we won't develop as fully as we might.
Yeah. It's really interesting. This is one of the things that really interests me about our reality. And I mean, none of us can sit here and sort of say, yes, I have the answer, or we have the answer, or we're getting close to the answer of what's it all about. No matter what field of exploration we want to kind of follow as we pursue this question of what's it all about, they will kind of come to the same sort of, or are coming to the same sort of conclusions. The labels of that you were referring to there, that I have come across various people that will cite the intergalactic wars of that go on around us. It's not a life view or a perspective or a lens that I look through particularly myself personally, but it is symbolic of what we might go down as original sin, good and evil. And if we're fighting and trying to connect to our heart, then we are following a path of good, we think, we suppose, we presume. So I think you must have some very personal thoughts about the nature of humanity, about who we really are in ourselves. Are those sort of thoughts that you feel as though you can share now?
Well, I can tell you this. Every person I know in the field of parapsychology, and I bet it's true of you as well, when you speak in public, people will come up to you and say, let me tell you about my experience. And they often preface it by saying, and I've never told anybody before, because people are afraid to talk about it. And yet almost everyone, at least I think the statistics show 70% of people have had paranormal experiences, but so many people are afraid to discuss it because other people will laugh at them or think that they're crazy. And that's the shame. We're suppressing our own natural talents as a population. And so I think one of the things that I am doing by putting out 4 to 5 videos every week on the New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube is trying to get the conversation going so that people will feel more comfortable talking about and acknowledging and even cultivating their own inner talents.
That's a lovely thing to hear, Jeffrey. I really love the way that you're living that, because it seems to me that was one of the early things that struck me. Was it's like, this stuff is it's in all of us. Surely it has to be. And again, coming back to your essay, this is one of the things that really jumps out of your essay as well. I'll put a link to that so that people can read the thing. It's a great bit of work, I have to say. Why do you feel so passionate about helping people like that see this truth?
Well, maybe it was my destiny. It's some people in esoteric traditions suggest that we make a contract before we're even born as to what our role is going to be in this life, what are the challenges that we're going to face, or the opportunities or the struggles we're going to deal with. And I suspect that was something like that was going on with me, because I certainly, if you had looked at my childhood growing up in the Midwestern United States, I started my college career thinking I'd get a business degree and go into the furniture business like my father. But things changed, not just for me, but for an entire generation coming of age in the 1960s.
Of course, that was a hugely transformative time, wasn't it?
It certainly was, yeah.
Of course. You did actually describe yourself. Yes, I know what it was. You wrote a book called PK Man about Ted Owens. And you worked with him for some years. And you said, sorry, just tell the listeners.
Well, as a matter of fact, I first met him face to face in London in 1976. There was a conference at the University of London sponsored by an organization called the Parascience Foundation. And Ted Owens had been invited to speak there because he had a reputation even then for being able to end droughts. And there was a terrible drought that year. When I arrived, my friends whom I was staying with said, if you would like to have your picture on the front page of the London Times, all you have to do is walk down in Piccadilly Circus carrying an umbrella. People will think you're crazy and they'll take your picture and it'll be on the front page of the paper. But this fellow, Ted Owens, when he arrived in London, it began raining and pouring to such an extent that to close down the tubes. And the newspapers announced, like within a day or two, the drought is over, which was amazing, because a couple of days before that, the newspaper headlines said no end in sight to the drought.
Yeah, go on. Tell me more about Ted, because he was ashamed.
And well, the thing is, he's this big, boisterous American. And he walked onto the stage at the University of London carrying a red toy wagon piled high with papers, which he said were proof of his amazing abilities, that he was the world's greatest psychic. And he literally got booed off the stage.
Oh, wow.
with this British audience. They didn't take to that kind of an attitude. And I actually stood up for him because I knew about an earlier episode that happened in the United States, in California, where he had ended a similar drought, which is why he was invited to London in the first place. And we became friends as a result of my speaking out in his behalf. And I spent the next 10 years studying his abilities. He claimed that he was in telepathic contact with hyperspace aliens living in an invisible UFO hovering over the Earth, and that they were the ones who bestowed these enormous powers on him. And it was part of an experiment that they were conducting just to see how the human population would react to a person with such abilities.
Yeah, so again, I have to kind of go, oh, okay, so that's the symbolism of those greater powers that we as people can be subject to, and say, well, okay, I don't necessarily kind of buy into the labels of the spacecraft, but in terms of an intelligence out there having influence upon us and possibly doing some interesting work with us, yeah, why not? I get that. I'm kind of along with that. The interesting thing about your story of Ted, I hadn't realised it was 1976 when you first met him, and that there was the whole drought thing. Because that's about, I would have been 14. I remember 76. I remember the summer extremely well. I don't remember it coming to an end that summer, but there we go. But that was obviously his fault. But what's your view? What was your, after all of these years, because you published your PK Man book in 2000, you'd started writing it around 1980 or in the 80s certainly, I believe. But what's your view though there on how a person can actually influence reality, their own personal reality, to the extent that he did, and also obviously it was affecting the reality of other people too. Because after all of these interviews that you've done and all of this research, you must have a personal view of it, Jeffrey.
Well, if I could explain it to you very simply, I would say this: the whole universe is alive, and we're part of it. Tom Campbell, the physicist, refers to what he calls the larger consciousness system, or you could think of it in religious terms as God. I'm not partial one way or the other. You could look at it from the point of view of theology or the point of view of philosophy, but it's pretty clear to me that we are embedded in a system that responds to us. That's how Jungian synchronicities occur, because the universe has a way of communicating directly to individuals.
In fact, I see quite a lot of modern science, although much of my access to modern sort of development of theories is through journals like New Scientist magazine, so it's journalist viewpoint, but a lot of scientists now are regarding the universe as the intelligent mind. They are picking up on that and really starting to run with it as a possible explanation, and looking at the nature of events as interconnected aspects of creation, not just A affects B and that's it. So it's a really fascinating time to be alive and in this. I do just want to refer you to something that you now you have in your essay. You feature several clips from a lot of your interviews that you've done, and there was one there that jumped out at me, which was one that you did with Bernard Carr, and he refers to various levels of space having different associated experiences of mind with them, and refers to hyperspace. And you say in your essay, one finds related hyperspace approaches to consciousness in Nobel laureate physicist Wolfgang Pauli's Jungian dream work, where an archetypal figure presented a theoretical model to him. Now, that jumped out at me because Wolfgang Pauli is probably one of the, I guess for us laymen, one of the lesser known kind of quantum physicists of that kind of Einstein era. I think it's a little bit after Einstein, is he? I believe, I'm not sure. But his he did some really fascinating work, and so this jumped out at me.
Well, yes, it's very interesting that you would highlight that. Pauli is actually one of the greats in physics, and he worked very closely with the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. And when Jung came up with his theory of synchronicity, which was published in the 1950s, it was published in a book that also contained an essay by Pauli. Pauli helped Jung develop the theory of synchronicity. And Pauli was himself, he was a troubled person in some ways, and he was involved in Jungian therapy. And in the therapy, many of his dreams were discussed. This has all now come out in published books that have all the correspondence between Jung and Pauli. And one of those books is titled From Atom to Archetype, for any of your viewers who would like to follow up. And in this book, Pauli describes a whole series of dreams in which a mysterious dark woman came to him, and he was asking her, what is the relationship between mind and matter? And she explained it to him using complex symbols that suggest that you could create a graph of the real numbers intersecting what we know of as the imaginary numbers. This is standard mathematics. Imaginary numbers are numbers that are times the square root of -1. Well, -1 doesn't have a square root normally. It's an imaginary square root because all numbers that are squared have to be positive numbers. So the square of a minus number is an imaginary number. But if you map that out, you've got two, you could call them sets of Cartesian coordinates that intersect each other, the real number set and the set of imaginary numbers. And where those two planes, Cartesian coordinate planes, intersect each other in this dream became the intersection of mind and matter. It's really a very elegant system.
How is this reality created? What's your views on the power of that subjective reality that we experience?
This internal reality is thought of as unimportant, trivial, fantasy, imagination, not really of any substance. In the imaginal realm, you could say that things are mental, but they are also ontologically real.